I'm Daniel Minty, a cognitive behavioral therapist, teacher, and writer. My colleague Matthew May is an adjunct faculty member at Stanford University's Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Science. Matt and I also teach together at the California-based Feeling Good Institutes. We spoke to a class there recently about therapy intensives, a format which provides a patient up to 6 hours of therapy a day, 5 or more days in a row. Between us, Matt and I have likely conducted close to 80 such intensives. What follows is an audio recording of our comments about this format. So when I talk about an intensive course of therapy, typically what that looks like in my practice is I would meet with a patient 4 to 6 hours a day for 4 or 5 days running. So typically I might meet with someone, say from 10 to 12, have an hour off, meet from 1 to 3. And then maybe if we have the bandwidth for it, meet again like 4 to 6. So the actual therapy would be in 100-minute blocks and time in between. And going to be doing one next week. I think we're going, something like that for 4 days. So you can end up doing, 6 months of weekly therapy in a week or less than a week. And that dose seems to be one of the active ingredients in the outcome of the therapy. I have a little thing on my website about intensives and just say, it's like planting a garden or painting your house or something. There's this much work to do, and you can chunk it out and do it in weekly installments, or you can just sit down and do it. And that's largely my experience of that work. So for a person to make that commitment, I think is another active ingredient. I ask people to pay up front for the time. And so they're setting aside a chunk of their lives. They're putting a chunk of change on the table. And, in weekly therapy, that doesn't happen. So there's some buy-in, literally, on their side to do something that most of them haven't done. I did an intensive with one person twice. I did one in person and one online. But for the most part, this is not something people have done before. And so it's a bit like going on a retreat, say. Maybe we meditate for an hour a day. But to either leave home, or if it's a virtual, all of my sessions are virtual now, to say, I'm just going to sit for 12, 15 hours a day for 7 days. That registers differently with us. We're doing the same thing, but we're doing something different as well. So the venue it is different. The work, I think, is the same. The venue is different. And what I ask folks to do, most people that I would do an intensive with, not all, most I have some kind of relationship with. I've seen them at least a time or two. I'm thinking of one case where all I did was the intensive with the person. But what I'll ask them to do is to create a list of the things that they want out of that time and to spend some time doing that. So what typically I'll get is a page or two, either a narrative or bullet points, and the person saying, this is what I want. I'm making a massive investment, and this is what I'm hoping to get in return. I think that's important too. They're setting an intention. It's not, I'm going to go hang out with Daniel, we'll see what happens. No, it's here's what I want. from you, Daniel. And then what I'll do is review that and sometimes consult with one of you guys. I may call you up and say, wow, and I have this chunk of time with this person, and here are the issues. Usually there are multiple issues. The one next week has trauma elements, has strong relational stuff, has some intense feelings of worthlessness and shame. And this person is actually evolving their list. And I encourage them to do that. I said, just send me what you have. When you edit it, send me the updates. And then the wheels are turning in my mind. And I'm connecting those 15, 20 hours with the list and starting to get a roadmap for the time together. If things go more or less the way that I would expect that they would, we'd be doing this in the first hour, this in the second, and so forth. And it's a way of tracking the agenda that we have against the work that we're doing to see if we're covering those spaces or not. So during the intensive itself, and we could maybe get more into the mechanics after Matt's had a chance to talk in a more general way. I give people the choice, like between 2-hour blocks, say, if they want to work, I'll give them homework. So the work after 100 minutes will be at a certain point. They could move that forward, while they eat lunch or whenever, and then bring back in that work. And that can keep the momentum going and actually give them a more intensive experience. The 4 to 6 hours can become 5-7 hours of work during the day. And then if they're interested in the evenings, I give them work. When I was doing these in person, people would come into town, they'd get a motel. And often they'd say, I want to work tonight. I don't want to sit in my motel room and watch television or something. So I give them an hour or two of work to do in the evening. And those slots are nice slots for doing some exposure. So this last person I did an in-person with here in Taos had a lot of social anxiety, social phobia. And his room was down near the plaza. So he had some assignments to go out and interact with people and make notes, collect data for us to look at when we got together the next morning. It would be a time to address some procrastination things. So I had a fellow who was trying to decide about a job. He had a lot of anxiety and was in a job that he wasn't very happy with. And I thought there was probably some correlations between his professional dissatisfaction and his anxiety. He thought so too. So I gave him some assignments to call his boss. He actually called his boss and resigned from his job. That was one of his homework assignments. It was something that he'd been putting off. And we both realized, if you keep putting it off, you're going to keep being anxious. But you could just call the person and say, I'm giving you my 2 weeks notice. I'll send in paperwork. He did. And that was a real turning point for him in the work that we were doing. So there's a lot of room to work when you have that much time with someone. And if they're out of their usual digs and, here in Taos, and really all that they're doing is the work, I think that can build some momentum and intensity in and of itself. It's like going on the retreat. You leave home, you go to the retreat house, the mountains or wherever. And everything around you reminds you, I'm doing this. I'm not doing my life. I'm doing something else. I think that can also be a deficit, because the problems that we experience in our lives come up at a certain GPS point. So it's in our homes, it's relating to our families, it's relating to our boss, our colleagues, etc. And there can be a kind of escape element, particularly if it's anxiety that the person's asking for help with. And I've noticed that one of the strengths of doing online intensive with people in their homes is that they can have conversations with their spouse as part of homework. And ahead of time, I'll actually suggest to them they could invite their spouse to support the intensive by being available to talk about things. Or this one fellow had some parent-child things that were important parts of what he was trying to figure out. So the downside of having people come to us is they're not around their people. That can be an upside too. You know, if someone's feeling tremendously overwhelmed, being a mom and being a wife and doing all these things, going away from that and having the space to just focus on, you know, what's going on internally could be tremendously supportive of her healing. But if there is this element of I'm going to run away from my problems, then that will get in the way both of the work that we do and then the reintegration of the person back into their lives. So when someone, I don't even know if I'll ever do this again, I may just only see people online the rest of my life. But if someone came to Taos and did an intensive, and then they were going home, I would make sure that like the last couple hours of the intensive addressed going back home. And they would have a list of things that they were going to do in the next 24, 48, 72 hours to build on the work that we'd done individually. And then there'd be a reporting system there too. I've created some docs where people can quantify what happens when they go home, how they're feeling, what they're doing, and send those to me. And then we typically would set up an appointment, maybe a week later, a follow-up appointment. And sometimes what happens with the follow-up is the person just feels like, well, I am just, you know, out of the forest. This is great. And thanks so much. These things that we wanted to accomplish, we've accomplished. I know what I need to do going forward to consolidate those. And that's wonderful for them and for us when we just have this great success. Other times, people run into something that they or we hadn't anticipated. And we'll actually end up doing another course of work with each other to address that. This one fellow actually did another intensive. And it was that second intensive that really put his feet on the road. He's been walking that road for years now and pretty solid on it. We touch bases from time to time. So those are some experiences and rather random thoughts. There's probably a lot of other components here that I'm not speaking to. But that's why I have my silent partner to tell us what I'm not saying, and would love to hand things over to you, Matt.
Thank you, Daniel. I really appreciated that overview of the intensive model. Maybe I'll add a few things, and I want to respond to some questions coming up in the chat. For one thing, I want to reiterate that I think the intensive model of therapy is by far my favorite. I've done a lot of intensives in the past and had the great pleasure of treating people both from different parts of the United States and from around the world. And pretty much every experience I've had has just been wonderful doing intensive, just seeing tremendous growth and improvement, recovery occurring at a very rapid rate. And to underscore that a little bit, I think we can define intensive therapy a couple different ways. I like Daniel's definition and sort of the ballpark guesstimate of maybe 4 hours a day for maybe 5 days or more. I think another way of defining intensive therapy is just anything that's more than the 1 hour per week model. And the 1 hour per week model there's been some studies to show there's basically been no studies to show that that's the appropriate dosage of psychotherapy. And there's been one study that I'm aware of out of UCLA that showed if you just double the number of hours that people are getting of psychotherapy, you're just cutting their recovery time in half. So it's just makes sense if you want people to get better faster that you would see them more frequently and for longer periods of time. And I would one metaphor that I think is useful there is like a foreign language immersion course where you are fully immersed in the language and you see results quickly, and that seeing of results I think creates a sense of hope, optimism, and a realization, oh, this stuff really works. And I think that has long-term effects for people, because a lot of people enter into therapy with a sense of this isn't going to work or it's going to take years, etc. And we can overcome those beliefs pretty quickly doing an intensive. I think to compare that, if you're doing an hour a week of therapy, oftentimes you can get the sense that it's kind of like lighting one match under a pot of water, and then next week lighting another match and expecting it to boil. And I don't think that's very realistic. And you've probably also noticed that a lot of your time in session, if you're doing an hour a week, is spent getting caught up, like what happened this week, and empathizing with what's going on in this immediate moment. And then other kind of things come up that you just it's essentially wasting time, scheduling sessions, etc. But when you've got the patient there in your office for multiple hours in a row, you can really focus and you can stay on one thread of focus on one agenda for like 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours. Try multiple different techniques, and you're both focused. You're both doing the work, and it creates a very different experience and rapid results. Wanted to talk. I think there are a couple of other topics I want to get into at some point. One of them is things to make sure you've covered before you do an intensive and screening your patients. Obviously, there'll be some folks where this would not be an appropriate intervention. Sometimes they're flying, right? Sometimes they've got a substance use problem that would interfere with them benefiting, or they might have psychosis or mania or something that would prevent them from taking advantage of that time. And sometimes they just have enough resistance to recovery, wouldn't want to use the tools that we have to offer them. So I think it's beneficial to do a lot of empathy, a lot of agenda setting up front to make sure they're really on board with what we have to offer. So when they arrive, they haven't plunked down all this money, made this huge commitment, and then realize, oh, I'm not willing to do X, Y, or Z, and that stops the process. I think we can also talk about making sure if they're coming from out of state, making sure they have follow-up treatment plans, making sure we're working in collaboration with their current providers. And we can come back to those topics, but I'm seeing some questions about payment and want to just talk about that briefly. So for one, Donna, you asked, how do you figure out the payment or the fees for that? That's a great question. So I like to structure the payment so that it provides an incentive both for the patient and myself to achieve rapid recovery. And so the way that I do that is that I ask for the payment up front, and I offer a discount for making that commitment, about a 10% discount. And then I let them know that if they recover prematurely, say they've scheduled a 5-day intensive And on day 3, they make a complete recovery, and we make it all the way through relapse prevention, and they're feeling great. That 50% of the unused time, the cost of that will be returned to them, and 50% will go to me. And that means that we both get rewarded for doing an excellent job and achieving results as quickly as possible. So we're motivated throughout that whole time. I want to get paid for doing nothing. They want to get some money back. And of course, we both want to see them recover. In terms of when folks are financially, Philip, I saw your question. I'm just trying to find it again. But the question is, what if your patient can't afford it? Clearly, my sense there is that we never want to be in a position where we're causing more stress to our, our job is to reduce anxiety. And so we don't want to put forth or accept a patient where they're paying for our services would put them in financial stress. And so in those cases, I just recommend that they might work with someone else within the team model, but work with someone whose fee is a little bit closer to their budget. And if they're still wanting to do an intensive, to do that. And the reason for that is I don't want people to get into a position where, okay, they've completed 10 hours of an intensive, but they're still wanting a little bit more, and then they have to switch therapists. I think that can be a problem. And I think just having the pressure, okay, I've got to make this work. This is my only chance at an intensive psychotherapy, and I'll never get another chance if this doesn't work. I think that can put someone in a fight or flight kind of mindset, which makes it harder to focus on the therapy. And so I would want to, and at the same time, I think that an intensive is probably the best gift you can give yourself during your lifetime. That if you suffer from depression or anxiety or relationship problems or what have you, and you do an intensive, that you will benefit from that for the rest of your life. So I think it's a fantastic investment to make. And so I just talk to people in that way. I say, here's what I think you stand to gain. Here's the carrot for this. I think it's a fantastic model, the best model for treatment we've got. And at the same time, I don't want to put you under any financial stress.
Thank you for listening. If you like what you've heard, consider leaving a comment and subscribing to the channel. I'll look forward to having you with us again soon.